Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, a new opinion piece published by Al Jazeera lays bare how Europe's migration policies, along with its poorly regulated arms transfers, have unintentionally strengthened Sudan's most violent warlords, fueling one of the continent's deadliest conflicts. The author, Zeenat Adam, argues that European funding aimed at controlling migration, combined with an opaque global weapons flows, empowered paramilitary groups like the Rapid Support Forces, deepening instability and contributing to widespread civilian suffering. Now, this comes, of course, as Sudan is entering its third year of a brutal civil war. And a few weeks ago, we saw what happened in the Al-Fasher region. And, of course, many human rights organizations saying that what we're seeing there is crimes against humanity and also genocide, which has been committed by the RSF. Zeenat joins us now. She's also an international relations strategist and no stranger to us here on Hilaal TV. Zeenat, absolute pleasure having you on. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran for having me on here.
No, it's absolute pleasure. Zeenat, I guess let's start off with us describing Europe's institutions and governments in their approval in funding these programs, and should they be charged for complicity in this brutal Sudan civil war?
I think the most important thing for us is that we've got to contextualize this. So Europe found themselves in a situation post-2015 where you had mass migration of people, refugees from Syria, from Libya, from other countries that were experiencing conflict. And this seemed to have caused a ripple effect into Europe as some of the countries began grappling with whether or not to welcome these refugees in terms of international law, where if a refugee pitches up at your borders, you have an obligation in terms of human rights to be able to give them that asylum, especially if they are fleeing from war. And so this was the context within which Europe found itself, but they felt that this was far too much of a burden on the European infrastructure. And they seem to have a growing far-right movement within Europe rejecting people from other countries and from other continents. So they needed to look at how to address this issue without seeming to be the bad guys by turning anyone away at their borders. And we saw a number of crises that had arisen in the Mediterranean, including the washing up of bodies of children and of human beings who were being trafficked across the seas. Europe then considered investing into the Sudanese forces on a two-pronged approach. The one was identifying that Sudan had been a pariah in the international community for a very long time and was seeking a means to be able to re-enter the international community structure, and that this would be a carrot that could be dangled before the Sudanese to say, we would capacitate your security forces if you form a border management force that stops the migration of Africans from Africa, including economic migrants, to coming in towards the Mediterranean. This was essentially the premise under which they worked. So whether or not there's complicity beyond that is what we have to look at in what has subsequently taken place since then in Sudan and in terms of the European context.
Zeenat, there's something interesting you mentioned in your article that as early as 2017, an advocacy group, the Enough Project, had warned that if you support Sudan's border forces, this will empower the Rapid Support Forces. Now, of course, what we see in Sudan, a lot of it has come in domestically, but from a foreign perspective, this is sort of the adding fuel to the fire. How has this been allowed in terms of the European Union's involvement in this?
The European Union could not have been ignorant of what was taking place in Sudan. I mean, this was a country that had been grappled with war for decades. They had just not a few years ago split from South Sudan. There had been the issues in Darfur in the early 2000s that were related to allegations of human rights abuses, genocide perpetrated by the Janjaweed, men on horseback, who have now transformed into the RSF. So there was no ignorance that Europe could have pled in relation to understanding the circumstances in Sudan. And that's what the Enough Project also points out, is that in providing this kind of capacity, including arms and including more than 200 million euros towards the Khartoum forces, this could not have been dealt with in a framework of ignorance. So Europe knew very well what they were doing. They knew that Sudan is a country of insecurity. So by 2017, the warnings were there to say that are we actually fueling what could later become a situation of further instability in Sudan? And that's what we're looking at.
Zeenat, European manufactured weapons have found their way into Sudan's deadliest areas. I mentioned Al-Fasher. And of course, there could be other countries that are supplying, the Sudanese army or even the rapid support forces. But I want to touch on, obviously, when we speak of the deadliest areas, Al-Fasher has really become one of those that have had a magnifying glass to that. Weak oversight and opaque arms flows. How has this been allowed in terms of the misuse of funds and arms?
In most of the war profiteering, there are ways and means that these companies tend to work around the international legalities that exist in order to protect against the illicit arms trade. So in Sudan, there's two phases to this. There's the illicit arms trade that continues to perpetrate where there's a flow of arms without being able to have the checks and balances of where that's coming from and how it's being utilized. But secondary to that is what we're picking up now is that Europe and other countries have been selling arms to third countries who are then onwardly providing those arms into Sudan. And what is being circumvented are the end user agreements. So usually in an agreement of an arms sale, there would be a clause within that to say there's an end user agreement that specifies that these particular arms, ammunition, and equipment would only be utilized by the country that is purchasing it. What we're finding is that those products are now being found on the battlefield in Sudan without it having been provided directly to the Sudanese. And the suspicion then is that it is coming via the third party. In many of the cases, we have discovered that this is through the UAE, but there may potentially be other countries that are the conduits to providing these arms. There has been evidence uncovered by Amnesty International that the French Gaelic system has been mounted onto the Nimr vehicles, and that there have been Bulgarian rounds that have also been found on the battlefield. But we're discovering through some of the images that are provided from Sudan and that have been coming out onto social media, this still has to be verified in terms of serial numbers, but even South Africa with Rheinmetall Denel, there is a potential that some of their products have been found on the battlefield.
Yeah, we're going to be discussing the South African aspect after the break. Just before we go towards closing this segment, Zeenat, you noted that EU engagement seems to have migration control, but the unintended outcomes was the strengthening of militant actors. Now, is this a difficult balancing act for the European Union, or do they really believe that this phrase of one hand can wash the other, in terms of, on one side, limiting migration, but also managing these militant groups?
I think to a great degree, it's the neo-colonial hypocrisy that we're looking at. They certainly still have a white supremacist vision of how the world should work, and that there's a top-down approach. We as Europe do not want these Africans coming into our space. We will do everything we can to be able to ensure that there are no further Africans crossing over the Mediterranean. We will support whatever forces there are, whether they are dubious or not, whether they have human rights records or not. And what the circumstances of that are, it's not our problem. We haven't actually engaged in a war in Sudan. These are warring parties within the Sudanese space, and it has nothing to do with us as Europe. And this is the question that arises. Perhaps from a legal perspective, it may be difficult to pinpoint the complicity, but from a moral standpoint, I think that it's very much traceable back to the decisions that Europe has taken in terms of this border management force.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Zeenat Adam, and we're going to be discussing the controls that needs to be enforced on arms exporters. And will that happen, and the role of state actors in terms of this? Do stay tuned. This conversation wraps up after the break. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Zeenat Adam. She penned a brilliant piece on Al Jazeera, and I think for the viewers out there that are really entrenched on what is happening in the Sudan civil war, this is a must-read in terms of how this has not occurred in a vacuum, and that how international players, especially the European Union, may have some sort of involvement with regards to this from an arms perspective, bringing in, of course, the migration perspective into this. Again, Zeenat, jazakallah so much for staying with us. You've mentioned that there must be calls for transparent audits of past licenses and export control reviews by arms exporters. You mentioned South Africa and, of course, this happening through Denel. Now, do you believe that arms exporters would allow for this to happen? And if they do not play their part in this, how do state actors come into play?
I think that we need to understand the arms industry and the war profiteering that takes place from that. These companies are in positions of extreme influence over politicians worldwide. And so there would be political reluctance to actually enforce the kind of laws that are already on paper. It's not that it doesn't exist in terms of the ability to do these audits. It's the enforcement of that auditing. For example, when we look at Denel and we look at a few years ago with the situation in Yemen where the war was taking place, we discovered that South Africa was providing arms and ammunition to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE. Those arms were being utilized within the Yemen war, and that goes against our laws as South Africa and against the end user agreements that we had. So the NCACC then put in an enforcement. They suspended the sale of arms to those countries for a particular period, and then requested that those countries allow for those audits to take place. Those countries were reluctant to allow for any inspections to take place. But ultimately, South Africa caved, and the sale of arms is continuing without the real audit and the inspection. And similarly with the Europeans. For a while, when there might be political pressure or international focus on this, there might be a little bit of a lens on them, and then they have a response to it, but later on become reluctant to do so because there is a strong lobby from the war profiteers and from the military-industrial complex that feeds into this.
And of course, before we go to the next question, you've got South Africa taking Israel to the ICJ, and then you've got Denel, which is a state-owned entity supplying weapons. A kind of very difficult contradiction there. But let's go to the next question, Zeenat. There was something interesting you mentioned in terms of how weapons are legally exported to third countries and then are now getting diverted into Sudan's civil war. How do we then allow for stricter weapons control in this regard? And can it happen given that this is being done through diversion? So, of course, the paperwork is probably left to the side and it's entering into spaces where it is not accounted for or audited for.
There's a couple of things that I discovered along looking into how these weapons are trafficked into places like Sudan or into the Horn of Africa, into Yemen and other spaces. And that is that, like we said, on paper and in terms of the legislations, in terms of the formalities that these companies have to adhere to, it's all quite strict, but in terms of the enforcement, that isn't happening. And how do we prevent that? It seems exceptionally difficult, especially in the case of Sudan, where you basically have a number of other countries outside who have vested interest in what is going on there. And I think it's worth it to give a little bit of perspective to the viewers, Fahraz, which we didn't do at the beginning, to give context as to what's going on in Sudan and how the civil war actually began. I think it's worthy of note that this began. We know that Sudan had been ruled by an authoritarian leader for a number of decades, and he utilized some of the forces like the Janjaweed, who then transformed into the RSF at a later stage, to be able to force some kind of perpetrate human rights abuses in Darfur a long time ago, and now that seems to be repeating. But it's also about the mineral resources. And then by 2019, you had a revolution, a civil revolution, where people stood up, deposed Omar al-Bashir, and wanted civilian law and a civilian rule. That was thwarted by the military, by the Sudan Armed Forces and the RSF collaboratively, to say that there is instability in the country, we're going to get together and we're going to take over for a temporary period, and then once the stability restored, we will hand it over back to a civilian rule. That hasn't happened. They've basically conducted a counter-revolution. And then you had the personality clashes where Hemeti said, I'm not going to be responding to Burhan, he's not going to be the boss of me. And initially, the RSF claimed to be restoring or supporting the idea of going back to civilian rule. But then they became the main perpetrators of human rights abuses, going door to door in Khartoum, in Omdurman, perpetrating human rights abuses. Now we've seen in Al-Fashir what has taken place. Hemeti has been one of the biggest warlords in that region for decades. He is one of the wealthiest in that region, gaining from the gold and uranium deposits that are there. And he has strong alliances with the UAE. We know the flow of gold going into the UAE is supplemented by the flow of arms coming into Sudan and continuing this destabilization that other actors seem to be benefiting from.
You mentioned the United Arab Emirates, and of course in this last few weeks, especially when we saw what happened in Al-Fashir, that country's name has been brought up. Now, obviously what we saw earlier on this year, the ICJ case, which was brought by the Sudanese government, it was thrown out by the courts due to a technicality. But the question of the United Arab Emirates continues to come, especially when we continue to uncover more atrocities that are happening during the civil war. Zeenat, where are we in terms of the United Arab Emirates in this? Because their government, and I'm sure they would, in their defense, say, well, we have absolutely no role in this. And when negotiations were being conducted, the United Arab Emirates was involved in it, and the Sudanese government said, we are not getting involved because of their involvement and their alleged funding to the Rapid Support Forces. What's your take on this right now, Zeenat, as we sit in December 2025?
So there have been various role players internationally into the Sudanese space and attempts to be able to bring the parties to the table in Geneva, in Jeddah, in other parts of the world. Currently, the UAE has put themselves forward as one of the brokers and mediators to this, which the Sudan Armed Forces are saying, if they are at the table, we cannot be there because we believe that they are fully involved in the support of the RSF, and that means that they are not a neutral party. We have seen what has taken place at the ICJ. That case was thrown out on a technicality, and there is an attempt by the Sudanese to bring it back once they have all of their ducks in a row, and to be able to put together their dossier that is a little bit stronger. But the international processes on paper might look fantastic. And I mean, we also know South Africa going to the ICJ to try and bring accountability of Israel on the genocide. It's a difficult and lengthy process. What it doesn't do is stop a war. What it doesn't do is stop a humanitarian crisis. And currently, Sudan is the most critical crisis that the world should be looking at. But unfortunately, the focus has not been on Sudan. And for the last 3 years, there's been almost a media blackout of what has been taking place. People have not been able to report from the ground. And this is a really difficult issue. But also, let's be honest about this, Faraz. This is happening in Africa, and people don't care how many people die in Africa.
And one final question to that. What role does South Africa then need to play, Zeenat? Because it's really seen as, I mean, here's my thing, Zeenat. It hosted the G20 summit. in all honesty, when you look at it from that perspective, it's supposed to be the leader, the captain of the African continent. And I kind of look at South Africa and think, where are you leading in terms of this brutality that is happening on our very own continent? Because it's great, and the South African government needs to be applauded for taking Israel to the ICJ for the genocide in Gaza. But my word, there needs to be something that needs to be done right on our very own doorstep.
Our history on the Sudan case goes back quite a long time. Under President Mbeki was involved very much in the issue of Darfur and in negotiating around that in the early 2000s. South Africa's position has been that the regional body should be able to address the issues in the region. And then there was the illustrious terminology that we have at the African Union, that there should be African solutions to African problems. But we're not seeing a solution emanating from the African continent for the Sudanese. And this is really a failure on our part. It is also quite disheartening that our president hosted one of the perpetrators of the crimes in Sudan. Hemeti was here in South Africa, I think it's a year ago or in January of this year. But we don't have an outcome as to what that meeting produced and whether or not South Africa is willing to play a bigger role in trying to mediate and support any of the processes towards finding peace in Sudan. And I think it's a failure on the part of our government that we're not doing enough on our African continent. And we do have a responsibility towards that.
And while that happens, millions and millions of Sudanese citizens continue to be displaced. Zeenat, always good having you on. Shukran so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
That's Zeenat Adam, international relations strategist, and of course the author of an article that she penned with Al Jazeera in terms of the European Union and its involvement in terms of arms transfers to the warring factions in Sudan, and also their management of the migration policy. You can't have both. And unfortunately, this is what we are seeing right now in the northern part of our continent. That's all we have for you here on News in Focus. From myself, Hospital, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.